Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William McKinley, and the focus is Liberator or Imperialist. The year is 1898. The fighting in the Spanish-American War has come to an end. It's a grand triumph for the Americans. They captured Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and now it's time to sit down and do the final negotiations for a final peace treaty. Those talks were going to take place in Paris. Now, what was the thinking of the Americans during this war? President McKinley had said it this way: well, we are conducting war, and until its conclusion, we must keep all we get. When the war is over, we must keep what we want. The question is, what did they want? At the start of the war, what the Americans wanted was the Spanish to give independence to Cuba. That's what this was all about. But now they found themselves in the possession of a lot more than Cuba, and they had to go through these negotiations and figure out what would they keep. Well, President McKinley asked his Secretary of State, William Day, his good longtime friend from Canton, Ohio, to serve one more opportunity and go lead these peace negotiations. He needed somebody he could trust. Day, frankly, wanted to retire and go home, but McKinley convinced him to do this one last service, so he resigned as Secretary of State, left for Europe. John Hay, who had been serving as the Minister to Great Britain, former personal secretary to President Lincoln during the Civil War, he actually came back to the United States to serve as Secretary of State. Negotiations got underway, and the Spanish actually started out by asking basically for everything back, and that, of course, was a non-starter. It was pretty clear that for Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, these were going to be in American hands going forward, and the Spanish eventually realized that's the case, and they said, you know what, fine, you can have them, but we also assume you're going to take on their debts, and the Americans said, again, that's a non-starter as well. Cuban debts were going to be paid by the Spanish, not by the Cuban people, not by the Americans. And again, the Spanish didn't have much leverage here, so those were pretty much conceded. The big question of all of this, though, was really about the Philippines, and that's really the focus of this episode. The Philippines were a series of islands 7,000 miles away from U.S. shore. Very few people in the United States knew anything about the Philippines, about their people, their culture, their language. This was an archipelago of 7,641 islands. Now, of course, there were only about 11 that were main large islands with large populations, Luzon being the largest, Manila being the capital. But throughout the Philippines, there were about 30 races, different dialects. They had no experience in government. Pretty much the Spanish had done all the governing, and that was one of the concerns about the Americans. If they let the Filipinos have independence, could they actually govern themselves effectively? Well, there was a group of people who thought the answer to that was yes, because actually a rebellion had been going on in the Philippines at the time of the Spanish-American War against the Spanish, and this was led by Emilio Aguinaldo. He was a 27-year-old charismatic leader who had about 30,000 militia on his hand, and they had been fighting to overthrow the Spanish to get their independence. And when the Americans showed up, these folks actually sought an alliance with the U.S. military, but the military for the Americans was pretty cautious about this. They kind of held Aguinaldo and his folks at a distance. Aguinaldo got frustrated, and at one point he simply declared a new revolutionary government with himself as the president. The U.S. military largely ignored this. And when it came time to actually capture Manila, the Americans kept Aguinaldo and his band of militiamen actually off to the side. After that was over, they were ordered to disperse. Now, Aguinaldo realized that he really had no choice up against the American military, but he was not going to go quietly. He wasn't inclined to trade one oppressor in the Spanish for another in the Americans. A full-scale insurrection was launched by Aguinaldo, not against the Spanish anymore, but now against the Americans. President McKinley really had four options when it came to the Philippines. He could give them back to Spain. He could grant complete independence. He could take part of the archipelago, but not all, or he could take it all. Negotiations in Paris were underway for about a month or so when the president ultimately made his decision. There is a very general feeling that the United States, whatever it might prefer, is in a situation where it cannot let go, said the president. The interdependency of the several islands, their close relations with Luzon, the very great problem of what will become of the part we do not take, are receiving the thoughtful consideration of the people. It is my judgment that the well-considered opinion of the majority would be that duty requires we should take the archipelago, and that meant take it all. Perhaps an imperialistic motion, a reluctant imperialist? Well, William McKinley would always reject that label. This wasn't about imperialism, this was about liberation. It was about uplifting the Filipino people, being helpful, giving them independence when they're ready for it, when they're capable to actually manage things themselves. But not yet, because that was not the case. Now, this would be criticized, certainly by some in the United States, as being an imperialistic set of actions, but frankly, most Americans were cheering this. This was the great victory, now emerging as a global power. About a year later, McKinley talked a little bit more about this, and he told a public audience, "The truth is, I didn't want the Philippines when they came to us as a gift from the gods. When I realized the Philippines had dropped into our laps, I must confess I didn't know what to do with them. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I'm not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night." His ultimate conclusion: couldn't go back to the Spanish. If they take part, other European countries might come in and take the other part. That was unacceptable. They're not ready to run themselves. He felt he had no choice. He would take the full set of islands called the Philippines, the archipelago, and eventually give independence, but not until they're ready. Now, in a way, he felt he had no choice, but there was one point during this entire affair when he might have had a choice that could have led to a different outcome. Now, the following wasn't really seemed to be considered in the moment of it. But right after Commodore Dewey had captured the Philippine harbor, they had sunk the Spanish fleet, and the harbor was in American control, they had a choice to make. And the choice was to land 20,000 American soldiers and basically capture whatever they could in and around Manila and make sure the Spanish actually had no role in this war. But he probably really had another choice. He could have not landed any Americans on the Philippines. The Philippines, the whole reason to go after the Spanish fleet was to protect the west coast of the United States, and that was no longer at risk. The Spanish fleet had been sunk. If McKinley had decided to simply blockade to make sure no ships could come in, no way for the Spanish soldiers to get out, then the Philippines would have basically had to sit out the war, and the Americans would have nothing to fear from the Spanish fleet or any of the Spanish soldiers there. At that point, when the fighting was over, the Americans simply could have left. And this sort of would have been more in the American tradition of staying out of these sort of entangling alliances in far-off lands. They would have accomplished their military objective and then left things as they were without having sort of become invested in the islands by landing those soldiers into the Philippines. At that point, it was very difficult for the Americans to turn away and turn their back because they felt they had some commitment there. But if they hadn't landed in the first place, if they had simply blockaded, maybe he would have had more choice to simply leave. But that was not the case. That's hindsight 2020. In the current circumstances, McKinley felt he had no choice. He had to take them all, do as what he would call benevolent assimilation. That's what he called this. According to McKinley, we come not as invaders or conquerors, but as friends to protect the natives in their homes, in their employments, and in their personal and religious rights. This was always the view of William McKinley, but it also came with a catch, because there was an insurrection going on. Aguinaldo and his people were fighting against this. They did see the Americans not as liberators, but as oppressors, as imperialists. And McKinley had a warning for those folks. He told them that those who are taking up arms will be brought within the lawful rule we have assumed with firmness if need be, so benevolent assimilation, but also at the threat of arms. The impact on all this did have some impact back home because the treaty to end the war, the treaty negotiated in Paris, was actually stalled in the United States Senate. There were enough senators who thought all of this was too imperialistic, not only the Philippines, but Cuba and the other islands as well, and they were balking at the terms that had been negotiated in Paris. But the insurrection in the Philippines really turned things around, and the American senators ultimately agreed they had to bring this to a conclusion, and so the treaty went up for a vote. It passed the 2/3 supermajority by one vote. And this enabled the president to actually move forward. So he had to make actually some changes in the mix here as well. Secretary of War Alger, who had been strongly criticized for lack of preparation by the army going into this war, he was forced out. And McKinley went to kind of a different direction for the Secretary of War. Elihu was one of the top lawyers in the United States, but he had no military background. He didn't think he was qualified to be Secretary of War, but McKinley thought he was perfect. He wanted a top lawyer, given all of these challenges that the United States was facing for the first time, both with the military and the civilian combined. He wanted Root, and Root eventually agreed. One other note before we get back to the Philippines that McKinley was particularly proud of as a result of the Spanish-American War. He was able to witness firsthand the fighting alongside of Northerners and Southerners, former Union loyalists and former Confederate rebels. They had not come together across many parts of the country up until this point, and fighting together in the military as volunteers for the American cause in the Spanish-American War, this to McKinley was one of the great outcomes of the war, was to again try to get rid of some of that animosity that was still holding over the Americans' heads between North and South. Now, back to the Philippines moving forward. Under Elihu Root as Secretary of War, he had General Elwell Otis in charge as the military governor. Now, his orders were to be benevolent, that was the guiding principle, but still insist on compliance with their rulings, and there would be no tolerance for the insurrection, none. The battles were actually pretty small with Aguinaldo and his men, but they were incessant, and frankly, Otis continued to ask for more troops. He started out with about 30,000 soldiers. Within a year, it was 50,000. Beyond that, it was 64,000 Americans. This was a lot of energy to try to quell this insurrection. What about the civilian side? Root and McKinley focused on a federal judge in Cincinnati by the name of William Howard Taft to take on the top civilian role in the Philippines. Now, this was going to be some convincing, as Taft didn't want to go. His whole career, he wanted to be a federal judge. He was in a lifetime appointment. He didn't really want to give this up to go halfway around the world, but frankly, McKinley and Root were pretty aggressive when they brought Taft to the White House to talk about it. This was his call to duty, and eventually Taft agreed to serve. He would focus on the civilian side, trying to stand up the government, while Otis would focus on the military side, try to repress that rebellion. This would continue in a rather slow slog for the next couple of years. Very slow progress, steady progress, but slow progress on the government side. Very slow progress as well on the insurrection against Aguinaldo, and they couldn't move past this until he was captured and finally the militia stood down. That finally happened a month after McKinley took his oath of office for the second time as president. This is April now of 1901. Some really good intel. They finally had kind of a daring scheme, captured Aguinaldo. He was sent to a prison, and eventually he gave in. From his prison cell, he said, "Enough of blood, enough of tears and desolation. By acknowledging and accepting the sovereignty of the United States throughout the entire archipelago, as I now do without reservation on my part, I believe that I am serving thee, my beloved country." And just like that, the militia stood down. 2 years of fighting was over. The hands of the Philippines were now entirely within the United States. That meant that the military rule could stand down. Everything would transition to the civilian. July 4th, 1901, Taft was named as the first American Governor General. He would continue to try to bring the locals into that government. The U.S., though, again, very much in charge, and would be in charge for almost half a century. And this was a part of the rub. The Filipinos would often come to Washington, D.C., asking for full independence, and it kept getting put off. It wouldn't be till after World War II, 1946, again, nearly half a century, before American sovereignty was handed over to the Philippines and the country was back in their hands. To William McKinley, this was never imperialism. He said publicly, there can be no imperialism. Those who have faith in the Republic are against it, so that there is universal abhorrence for it and unanimous opposition to it. We believe that the century of free government which the American people have enjoyed has not rendered them irresolute and faithless, but has fitted them for the great task of lifting up and assisting to better conditions and larger liberty those distant peoples who through the issue of battle have become our wards. This was about liberation, this was about help, and certainly well-meaning, but depends on where you sat. If you sat in the Philippines, or Cuba, as we'll talk about in the next episode, there was a different perspective, at least in parts of the country, because again, depending on where you sit, is it liberation, is it imperialism? That's very much in the eye of the beholder. This was, again, the story of the Philippines. There would be challenges in Cuba and other parts of foreign affairs coming out of the war for William McKinley in the United States, but that's a story for another day. That is William McKinley and Liberator or Imperialist from the life of William McKinley. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.